I just want to say a word or two about this event and the sponsors. One tends, attending these things, to go, oh yeah, sponsors, big deal. But as the guy who was on the hook along with Mike Keller, normally one takes 12 months to plan this sort of thing. The idea for this occurred about 7 weeks ago. And it, first of all, is a real testimony to the power of Doug's vision, because everybody was incredibly good-natured, after they got over the "you're doing what on when" thing. But our sponsors in particular, I mean, as you might guess, your cost of your ticket doesn't even begin to cover the cost of this day. And I had to call up the sponsors and say, we need a really large check from you, and you have no time to think about it. I need an answer in 24 hours. And our four sponsors, Sun and IBM, and well, not just our four, but all of our sponsors came through in a really good-spirited way. So, good, I think everybody's back. Let's bring on our next panel. And as they're coming on stage, the purpose of this panel is to look at the sweep of the last 30 years. Just what was the impact of the augment ideas and the NLS ideas, but writ large. Where were the places this bubbled up? What were the surprises? What were the links? What were the various things that happened over the last 30 years? As everyone is miking up, off to my far left is Denise Caruso. Also, you didn't have the list of panelists completely on your sheets. Well, actually, you did. We have a couple of stealth panelists. The first one is Denise Caruso, columnist with the New York Times. Denise is also a visiting scholar at Interval Research, and she's been covering Silicon Valley since 1984. And she's one of those marvelous professional bystanders in this valley who isn't just a bystander. She's actually working on ideas and products over at Interval. She's just a wonderful person to have her. She made the mistake of coming up to say hi at the last break. And I said, oh, you're here. Good. What are you doing for the next 30 minutes? Next to Denise is someone else who also made that mistake, but at about 8:30 this morning, and that's Don Nielson, who until recently was a vice president at SRI. He ran the computing division there for 15 years. That was the division that Doug's work was being done in. Don is one of the handful of the most distinguished computer scientists here in Silicon Valley. And also, he's very close to our hearts at Stanford Silicon Valley Archives, because he's working on a book about the history of SRI, and we're hoping we might be able to convince him to bring his papers over when he is done. Next to Don is Howard Rheingold. Howard is sort of the coyote of Silicon Valley. He is a one-man early warning system for us all. He put the term virtual communities on the map when nobody was really even thinking about it with his book of the same title. He's a fabulous sense maker and bystander, but he also builds. He started Electric Minds, which was one of the real early visionary virtual community startups, immensely popular. He was also deep into he's one of the cornerstone members of the Well. He has written extensively about the subjects we're interested in, and in fact, his book in 1984, Tools for Thought, has a chapter on Doug Engelbart. I think it's titled The Loneliness of the Long-Distance Thinker. And it is one of my very favorite essays about Doug. It's one I regularly turn to again and again. Pierluigi Zappacosta is an entrepreneur. He had a little startup company called Logitech, which he co-founded. They make, mice. And actually, Pierre is now got a new company, Digital Persona, which he is the chairman of. And the wonderful thing that Digital Persona is one of the supporters here, because Pierluigi believes in Doug's ideas and has such a big heart. He has provided a safe harbor for the Bootstrap Foundation for many years now over at Logitech. And I, having no shame, called up Pierre and said, how can you help me at this event? He said, we'd love to be a supporter at Digital Persona. Of course, they're a very small startup company, and if what I'll do is they'll be a supporter and they'll just take it out of my salary next month. So, last but not least, is Mark Andreessen, who he was a student at University of Illinois and got sidetracked and wrote this little thing called Mosaic that people who were tired of Gopher thought was kind of interesting. And one thing led to another. He kept some bad company, ran into Jim Clark, deflected Jim Clark's plans to do an interactive television startup, and voila, we had Netscape. What more do I need to say? So welcome to you all. I know this in some ways is the hardest panel of the day, to look back on the last 30 years and say, where were the surprises? What mattered most? If we look back on this 30 years from now, what, with Doug's ideas in mind, are we most going to remember?
Personally, that just being very loosely associated with him, I ended up on this panel with no other merit. So that's quite a statement about the power of that. But seriously, I think the biggest impression is that with all the great things that Doug has done, so little of his work is known and appreciated, which of course is great for Logitech because the mouse has taken center stage. And I've been thinking about this for a long time, so the mouse is really a powerful icon for modern computing. It deserves all the attention. But think of all the other things he has done, and yet not much of his work is known. That's really a surprise.
Don.
I think it's really hard to overestimate the breadth of Doug's concepts. And let me give you a case in point that was touched on a little bit earlier in the earlier panel. Intrinsic to his concepts are, of course, collaboration, distance being quite immaterial. Well, he mentioned earlier that the beginnings of the ARPANET were concurrent with this, and so the very second IMP came to SRI, UCLA the first. So the first ARPANET connection was to these two sites. It was not long thereafter that SRI got involved in the early design of the network. Those of you who live RFCs, number 2, 4, and 5 were written at SRI. And then reports of that day, things like virtual circuits appeared and the things that we take for granted today. And that wouldn't have happened without Doug's involvement in that early ARPA development group and concept. You couldn't get onto the ARPANET or the early stage of the internet for 21 years unless you went through the Augmentation Research Center, NIC. And that wasn't even in the main bow wave of it. So I'm just saying the width of this and the implications of today are really impossible to overestimate because he has set his goals so high. But from a networking point of view, you can't talk about the beginnings of those networks without talking about Doug and his people. We dropped out of the technical network design business not long thereafter to re-enter it through the first internet transmissions later, but those beginnings were Doug's.
Denise.
I guess the thing that from having come lately in '84 and sort of watching the industry is the most surprising thing to me is how little we were willing to settle for over the last 15 years. I
Bill
interviewed.
Gates, are you listening?
I interviewed Doug when I was doing that TV show, The Site, for MSNBC, and so I got to look at all the old video, the full demo, the video, and it's staggering to me that we still aren't to the point where we have that level of ease of use. And, I suppose a million books could be written about, why we settled for so little, but that's the thing that strikes me.
Howard? Mark?
Well, what strikes me now is what struck me then when I first met Doug was that his vision really encompassed not just the know-how, which I think we are immersed in the degree to which that know-how has evolved, but the know what, and I think the what, as he put it, was to increase the ability of individuals and groups and institutions to solve problems. And I might be wrong about this, but my impression from the first time I met Doug was that the know why was that he really saw that the human race and our collective ability to harness power, to do things, way back in 1950, was aiming at a point where we had a lot of problems to solve. And again, if you read his early papers, it's the ability to attack societal problems. And it's amazing that we do have on our desktops and in our pockets knowledge workshops. And we are connected into this vast community, and we take that all for granted. But we've seen in retrospect that there's something that the defense funding and the venture capitalists and the universities all fail to do, which is to furnish that missing element, that kind of squishy social stuff about how do we observe how these artifacts change the way we think and the way we work together in groups and the way those groups change institutions. And that unfinished part, I think, to me, is the most interesting because probably everyone is thinking the same thing that I think when I think about this, which is there's really no way to do that. If the market or the government or the university isn't going to handle it, we don't have institutions for that. And Doug was talking about that kind of paradigm blindness. So I think at the same time we have these miraculous tools that really have changed us, and we all know that, but there's something missing about what it all adds up to and what we're going to all do with it. And that institution is still missing. And I believe it's possible that the paradigm could change, and there would be a more concerted effort to understand not just the know-how, but the know-what and the know-why part of it.
I would really echo Denise's comments. The kind of surprising thing for me is that most of the people in the world who use the results of Doug's work have started to do so only in the last few years, 4 or 5 years, and still only a fraction of it, and that it took 30 years to reach the point where about 2% of the world population has access to the technology and the ideas is remarkable. The good news is we seem to be on a pretty fast ramp now, but we're still a long way from having the kind of broad-based impact that I think his work eventually will. With reference to Howard's comments, I think that it's kind of clear to me after watching this for a while that the technology, a lot of the tools that are coming out of this are very sort of values neutral, if you will. They're sort of a blank slate upon which we as people can choose to write whatever we want, or create whatever we want, or communicate whatever we want. And so, like any tools, these tools have a huge amount of power for good or for evil or for all kinds of purposes, and so they can be channeled in those different directions. And I think that the internet, for example, is a medium right now. We're starting to see how it can be used for both sets of purposes, and I think that's something that we have to watch, and was perhaps unanticipated.
That's an interesting observation. Howard, would you agree that the tools are value neutral?
No, in fact, I think that's part of the paradigm blindness that, the HLAMT talked about humans using language artifacts, methodology, and training. Well,
Repeat that again slowly.
The humans and the artifacts are the only visible part of it. And when we think technology, when we in the larger sense, society thinks technology, we really think about the visible parts, the gadgets. And technologies have a lot of connections to the way we live our lives. They do have political implications. There are changes that technologies will bring about. Some of them are positive, some of them are negative. And what seems to me that the whole system is lacking is foresight about that it's essentially we're taking kind of a laissez-faire Darwinian model. Let's throw these things out and let them grow. And I know that there's a real paradigm around that, but I'm still not convinced that we can't think as well about what we ought to do with these things as we've been able to engineer them.
Jump in, Doug.
Just to follow up on that, from a technological point of view, we think we're making great strides. From the social side of all this, it's still primordial soup. We're still waiting for the animal to crawl out on the land, I think, and institutions that are people-centered are very difficult to change. One of the amazing things about the internet is the willingness for people to freely share information at their own cost or their boss's cost or whatever. And yet for everyone who does that, there's an equally important, perhaps cloistered individual who worries about copyrights and about other things and protecting whatever their image is and how it should be shined in front of the world. And it's this interplay between people of varying perspectives, missions, goals, roles, that makes it hard to institutionalize a change. I mean, you can make things, but you can't make over people very easily.
One of the things that's always been interesting to me about Doug's work is it seems like it was so values-centric that almost scared people away from it. I mean, it's easier for people to think about technology if somebody tries to sell it to them by telling them they're going to be more productive in, minutes and hours a week or something like that, rather than giving people some sort of idea. It's a little bit squishy, it's a little bit too warm and fuzzy for MIS managers, I think, to think about, that there could be value in raising the water level of human knowledge inside of your organization. And, it's been a puzzlement to me to sort of like, I looked at this stuff and thought, well, this makes perfect sense. What is, something must be scary about it. What is it that's scary? I don't know what the answer is, but something is.
Well, it's true that Doug talks a lot about values, but I think the strongest value, I mean, of course, we are typically talking about Socrates and in absence of Socrates using whatever we have learned about the master. Nobody has really understood completely Doug. But what I understand of Doug is that, for instance, something which is very central is this idea of a community that evolved together. So he has very much this, if you want, the Darwinian idea. For him, it's not a negative. His lab was the place where this idea came out. He always gets upset if you say, oh, Doug's idea. No, he said, no, Doug's lab's invention, Doug's lab. He always saw a great value in the framework of having these people working together and sort of playing free market. So I think that he has strong values. He was hoping that out of this experimentation, good things would come out, but he was letting the evolution take its course. He wanted to, in fact, he does not want to tamper with evolution. He wants to make it faster. When he talks about getting the process faster, somehow he does not know the result in advance. He does not want to predict the result, but he wants to make sure that this progress happens quickly. I think that's to me is very important.
I want to explore this community building aspect a little bit of the last 30 years. Mark, when I look at what you've accomplished, I mean, you and Tim Berners-Lee, more than anyone else, have done more to build a global community, this platform for a global community that people participate in. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the genesis of your ideas, because I know you really didn't know about Doug Engelbart until long after Mosaic was built, and I think even after Netscape was founded. So how did, here you are, an undergraduate in Illinois, fiddling around, and you suddenly decided instead of watching a football game, you're going to build Mosaic.
Actually, it was instead of going to class, but that's okay.
Instead of going
Is any of my former professors out there? I apologize. What has happened, I think, over the last 30 years is almost a series, almost like waves coming into a beach, where each wave just gets a little bit successively further up the beach, and we as an industry, I think, have largely been involved in reinventing the wheel sort of over and over again and sort of making it a little bit rounder and a little bit bigger every time. And you know, when Tim and myself and the folks who were involved in the web early on were really getting into it, it was at a time where you had a couple things happening at once. One was the internet was reaching a scope where these kinds of tools started to get interesting on a broad basis, and the other was the personal computer with the graphical user interface had reached a point where it was pretty broadly available. So, you know, a lot of the building blocks had been sort of assembled over the last couple of decades in a very sort of slow and evolutionary way in retrospect. And so I think what the web was able to do was sort of then unlock the power that was already on people's desktops and the power that was already in the network that had already been built. The money had already been invested to build out the network to the point where it was at and to put PCs on people's desks. And that was good, and then a lot of that power could be unlocked by tying that all together. So we ended up just basically trying to spark that by introducing a few new pieces of technology to really try to do that.
How far into it before you realize this might be something big?
Yeah, you know, it's always funny as we all are now to be in the middle of an exponential growth curve, but especially in the very early days, because you know, we introduced the first version of Mosaic, for example, in the middle of the night in March of '93, and the first night we had 10 users, and the next day we had 100 users, and the day after that we had 1,000 users, the day after that we had 10,000 users. And we knew this because we had a corresponding number of tech support emails coming in. And you know, there's nothing quite like being, you know, a half dozen graduate students in a lab somewhere and having 1,000 emails a day of people asking, you know, well, wait a minute, well, you know, where do I click the mouse to do this? And you know, other sort of more creative messages like, you know, the cup holder on my PC doesn't work. And you know, you send back a message saying, you know, what cup holder? And they're like, well, you know, it's got to press a little button, the cup holder comes out. It's like, no, that's the CD-ROM drive. You know, so we sort of got to track the evolution of this on to a much sort of broader audience very, very fast. And throughout '93, it just grew like mad from our perspective. And once you get on one of those growth curves, it's just something I think just try to hang on to, which is where I think we largely are now.
So Howard, you've also lived right at this no man's land between entrepreneurship and meeting larger social challenges. You've tried to do it in your companies and the like. Can one plan a connection between entrepreneurship and, you know, the larger foresight issues, or does one just have to hope the marketplace does the best it can?
Well, it's kind of hard in the internet space, as they say, because of the pace at which it moves. I guess Mark knows as well as anybody else, if you're going to become an entrepreneur in the internet business, you don't grow your business. You pump it up as fast as you possibly can, and you partner and merge and acquire as fast as you possibly can, because it's reached the state where large concentrations of attention, capital, and power are necessary to survive. The interesting thing is that this kind of massification of the business of the internet is happening at the same time that amateurs are still have this platform for propagating whatever it is they want to propagate. Although I think it's matured to the point where you're never going to find a couple of Stanford kids who just put together a directory for their friends and grow that into Yahoo again. So I think that the hothouse atmosphere is good for doing some things, but is probably pretty bad for the kind of things that require growing it over a period of time.
You know, there's almost an unspoken assumption, hope, that perhaps the internet will be the vehicle that allows us to realize the larger goals, not just of Doug's work, but the larger goals that everyone wants to accomplish in terms of making society a better, more effective place. And I'm a little uneasy about that. You know, recall in 1950, just before television took off, no less than Mr. Sarnoff declared, he said, you know, television is going to be a vehicle for delivering the very best of theater and acting to the American people.
And elevate everybody's.
And it was only 12 years after that Newt Minow bemoaned it had become a vast wasteland. Now at moments, I wonder if we're not creating a vaster wasteland in cyberspace. Should we be hopeful of the internet or terrified? And I don't mean to give you a leading question.
You know,
Denise.
the thing that's completely different about the internet is that the means of distribution is in the hands of individuals, not in the hands of the networks or any big media companies. So that changes everything de facto, because it means if it's a vast wasteland, well, then there are things that are vastly wasteful.
The vast wasteland is the wasteland of that famous Pogo cartoon where Pogo is standing there and saying, "We have met the enemy, and
it is us," or "we are it," or whatever. Yeah, exactly right. I mean, yeah, there's going to be, as there is now, a ton of junk on the internet because that's what media companies put out and that's what television companies put out, and it's a bunch of junk. But, you know, there's always been a bunch of junk, and you don't have to, I mean, there's also a lot of really great stuff that people put out there themselves. So it's a powerful equalizing force.
I want to put one question to the audience out of curiosity. Show of hands, how many people found out about this event first over email or the World Wide Web? I hope nobody is here from the print media. I mean, I will say it's one thing that actually for us made this possible. When we had this crazy idea, we thought, boy, you know, without your invention, Mark, we couldn't have pulled this off. This, you know, in the 8 weeks we had, that the 6 people who had showed up, we could have all had a nice lunch. Done.
It's really hard to talk about whatever Doug did or whatever without talking about a confluence of several things. The infrastructure. I mean, this is stating the obvious. Moore's law. The gravitation of cycles to the individual. If we were still all huddled around remote access timeshare terminals, it would have been a different world to this day. And it's that confluence of 3 or 4 things, I think, that have built the world as this day, for better or for worse. And since the internet has been captured by the populace, you know, it will have all the ups and downs of it. I don't think any technologist will ever change that. And social systems are evolutionary. You know, we're talking about a revolution in terms of technology, clearly. I mean, 100 years from now, if you look back, this was a spike in time. But the evolution of ourselves is much more slowly, and therefore, I think that's a good explanation as to why Doug's goals aren't realizable.
Pierre Luigi.
Great respect for the ability of Doug to forecast the future, because, you know, even when people said, "Oh, he's wrong on this, on that, and that," eventually was always right. So if you look at the way he looked at first how optimistic he was about the impact of the computer. He said it was better than writing and the printing press together. And when you consider that his modus operandi with the computer was really as a communication medium, and then the internet is turning more and more to a communication medium, I go with Doug. I'm very optimistic, and these things will make a big difference. And yes, the internet is coming to resemble more and more the world. But what's wrong with that? The world is full of bad places, good restaurants, bad restaurants. You know, it's a world. And that's the internet, which is becoming a nice reflection of the world. But you need a good mouse.
Pierre Luigi, I started to ask you, I said, well, you know, Doug and his foundation have been around Logitech for a number of years, and have you seen any practical benefit from having them around? And then I went, oh, right.
There were practical benefits and positives and negatives. Okay, the positive was obvious. Anytime I had a new idea come in, like the time the guy came with the foot mouse, I went to Doug and said, "Doug, a foot mouse, this is a weird idea." I said, "Oh, no, I studied that and I discovered that you get tired to use this and that." They said, "Well, I also tried to do these other things and it didn't work. And then I tried this and that. And you know what worked? If you put something on your knee and then a receptor underneath your table, then that's very good. You don't get tired." So that was the positive that you could.
Now let's really hope Steve Jobs isn't here today.
There was a negative, if you allow me, and the negative was that given how all these many invention and contribution always were placed into this bigger overriding goal of doing the greatest good for the world, it make regular work look pitifully non-important. I'm no longer able to make an honest buck.
I have a few last questions, but just closing thoughts about the last 30 years and Doug's work.
I have one
Please,
thing
Tom.
I'd like to say. At SRI, I have a 7-minute clip of a videotape of a conference that took place here in Palo Alto in 1987, where Doug was being regaled. And it's a clip of shows the things you've seen this morning, and there's a little statement that the clip ends with. It's something like, Doug is saying, well, nobody understood what we were doing, and we had a really tough time getting support, but we kept going anyway. I wanted to say that because here's a visionary doing what he has to do. I'd like to announce something that Doug knows about, but most of you don't. The IEEE has an award called the von Neumann Award. It's for the kind of the highest contributions in information technology, or maybe technology in general. Doug is a recipient of that for 1999.
Of course, that still doesn't mean they understand Doug, but Howard.
I wanted to note that we have an enormous opportunity and responsibility to take these tools to the next level and to avoid magical thinking about the tools themselves getting us there. Doug and a lot of other people in this room have provided us with the tools to do some pretty incredible things. I can give you one example of what needs to be done, but I think that this is true in many realms. Just putting the internet and computer boxes in classrooms is not going to revolutionize our educational system. Some people out there have been working hard on how do you work with kids, and how do you work with what they need to learn, and how do you use these tools, and what works and what doesn't. And that information, that showing how you can take this enabling technology and apply it to an important social problem and come up with some things that work, that really needs to be propagated out there. And it's not just the educational system. There are a lot of other problems out there to be solved, and it may not appear that either the marketplace or the Defense Department or the university are going to provide the support for doing that. But Doug went for a long time without any support whatsoever because he had a pretty clear idea of the importance of the goal. And I think we all know the importance of the goal. We have these incredible technologies. They're not going to do the job for us. We need to do the job, and we need to use the technology to propagate that know-how.
I couldn't think of a better way to end the panel. Thank you all very much. If we could dim the lights and run the next video, please. She's wondering which direction the cable goes to. Don't you wish you could hire her? That is a video shot of the daughter of our next presenter, Alan Kay. It's no surprise that she might know a little something about computers, given who her father is. There's a very interesting thing happening in technology. You know, once you could always tell where the bleeding edge of technology was happening by following the smartest and most creative people. Once upon a time in the late 70s, they worked for the warlords at the Pentagon. And then they started turning up on Wall Street in the 80s during the boom in Wall Street. And in the last few years, what's happened is all the smartest people have turned up in another place, Hollywood. And Alan Kay, our next presenter, is not just hanging out in Hollywood, he is right in the thick of things. He's the vice president of R&D at Disney, which just is the latest in a long history of turning up in fascinating places, beginning in 1969 when he developed the first machine with a graphical user interface at the University of Utah. Soon after that, he went on to be one of the founders of the Palo Alto Research Center of Xerox Corporation, led one of the groups that played a key role in concert with the whole organization of taking that notion of graphical user interfaces and other things like laser printers and the like, and fusing it into the first practical system, the Alto, which of course we know where all of that led. He's gone on. After that, he was an Apple Fellow, helped create the future at Apple. He's has received numerous awards for his work. And the wonderful thing is that as long as he's been around, he's always been on the bleeding edge of innovation in this business, and that's exactly where he is today. Please join me in welcoming Alan Kay.
There was a question earlier about how do you get at the truth in history. And so the little girl, Laura, there, of course, was not my daughter, but the daughter of one of my assistants many years ago. And the thing that has always struck me about efforts at history is it doesn't really matter whether people have been dead for 3 centuries or not, that in fact it takes on a life of its own as soon as you try and pass stories along. And of course you can guess by that many of the things in my introduction weren't right either. But I take a kind of statistical view of this stuff, and my 2 favorite sayings about this are one by Picasso, who said that art is a lie that tells the truth. So you can't ever tell the truth directly, but you're always doing this and hoping that the shadows on the wall look kind of like what you're talking about. And the other one is by the German poet Goethe, who said, we should all be able to share the excitement of discovery without vain attempts to claim priority. So in fact, when you actually try and trace this stuff down, you find that there are a vast number of people compared to the ones who actually get honored. There are actually some dozens and even hundreds in the 60s who were engaged in similar matters here. But I think that if you take the statistical approach or the Monte Carlo approach to this, then everything is totally true. The other thing that struck me today was that showing the 1984 video, for the first time I realized that Steve Jobs knew exactly what Bill Gates was going to look like when he was 60 years old. And if you want somebody who can really predict the future on its important basis, you have to look to Steve. Actually, I actually am not too happy about the way things are going today. And I could sum it up by saying that my friend Mike Hammer likes to say about consultants. He says, consultant is a person who knows 100 ways to make love but doesn't have a girlfriend. And to me, who was a graduate student at this time, and I knew especially Jeff Rulison, then had visited SRI and had 103 fever, but got on the plane anyway to go out and see the great demo. The thing that's being missed here is the romance. And I don't think it's really possible for anybody to understand and grapple with what the demo meant back then and what it still means today without the romance. For example, we were in an auditorium which the stage was more than twice the width of this. The auditorium held more than 3,000 people. The itaphore that Bill English mentioned was way up and way back. And the screen on which the demo was given was at least 4 times the area of this, and I believe in my memory it was 6 times. It was huge. And so what we're talking about, we're trying to relive an experience that was larger than life in every way on something that is less than what it was 30 years ago. And I believe that what we should have done is just gone through a really great way of doing this would have been to go through the whole hour and a half of the demo in the scale that it was originally given, and I think we'd get some sense. It's like when I first went to the Saturn Apollo Museum in Cape Kennedy, Florida, and what could they have in there? Well, what they have in there is a Saturn rocket, one of the last 2 that wasn't shot off, and it is more than a 40-story building, and they have that 40-story building suspended about 12 feet over your head for 40 stories, a football field and a half down there. And at the very end is the little thing where the astronauts rode, and at the other end are these huge Saturn, these J2 engines. Each one of the rocket engines on the Saturn has more thrust in it than all of the engines on the shuttle launches that we do today. So the astronauts that went into space were sitting on something that had more explosive power in it than the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima. And as soon as I went into that museum, I realized, oh, this is what happened to the space program, is you can't put it on television. It was too big, it was too mighty, it was too heroic to actually be chronicled in most of the ways that we chronicle things. And this is what I think the significance of this demo was. Because I knew everything that they were going to show. I had seen it. And yet, it was one of the greatest experiences I've ever had in my life because it was the totality of the vision. It was the breadth of the vision, the depth of the vision, the number of different things they did, the way that they did it. Fantastic. One of the great things ever done, and I'm just sorry that you can't experience. I think everybody who is in this room, who was in that room 30 years ago, remembers it as romantic. It was a destiny thing. It wasn't that we should just do this and make the world accept this. It's that we should be doing things like this on this level, because to me, the big romance that's being celebrated here is the romance of humanity thinking its way out of its genetic structure. When you look back on history, the big things that have happened of when we have decided that ideas that we have invented we're going to try and use them to supersede what our genes and mammalian brains want us to do. And this is what the destiny of this thing is. And that's why when I was thinking about what to say here, typically when I give talks about history talks, I say a lot about Doug and NLS as it fed into the stuff we did at Park and so forth. And I thought that would be entirely inappropriate here, because what we want to do is focus on what was fantastic about what happened and what that actually means to us. That's why I want to bring that. That's why I'm not giving a presentation here. I would actually rather give these minutes up so you could see more of the original demo. So I just wanted to share a few memories with you. The first time I saw Doug, and I think to me this is my dominant image of Doug, was the first time I met him. I was working on a little desktop computer at Utah in '67, and Doug was making the rounds telling people in the ARPA projects what it was that they were doing, and they didn't have this system quite done. They had a previous single-user one done on a controlled data machine. They'd taken very careful movies of it, and Doug was lugging around a big Bell & Howell 16-millimeter projector that had been modified so he could freeze frame and run it at different speeds and run it backwards, because they discovered that nobody could see the cursor in a demo. People weren't used to seeing a cursor, and that he would actually have to stop it. And he had this hand control. He could stop the thing, and he could go up and say, here's the cursor, and watch what it's going to do next. So this is in the ARPA community in 1967. And to me, he was Moses opening the Red Sea, basically a biblical. And this symposium actually could have been done over Memorial Church, I think, and you'd have more of the sense of the grandeur of what he was trying to convey to people. The second time I saw Doug was at the ARPA contractors meeting, not the one that Doug mentioned, but the one right after that was held at one of the ski lodges at Utah. And my mentor, David Evans, had this unusual thing about graduate students. He actually treated us like human beings. And in fact, he went even further than that. He treated us like superhuman beings, that only you had the power to lower yourself in his estimation. And so he got us consulting jobs in industry. He used to take us to Washington to see how to get money from government agencies for research without lying to them. That was a very important part. And one of the things he did at this ARPA contractors meeting is he invited quite a few of the graduate students to go up there just to sit there on the grounds. If we couldn't say anything, but we could actually mix in with this group of all of the ARPA contractors in ARPA at that time. That included people like Minsky and McCarthy, and Gordon Bell was there, Wes Clark. Taylor was the head guy of that funding thing, and Larry Roberts was his assistant and everything. And there are many, many interesting things to see there. But one of the things that struck me deeply was that hardly any of these contractors agreed with each other, in spite of the fact that from a mile or two off, ARPA looked like the most cohesive, most vision-driven community you could imagine. And it was from a mile off. But in fact, there was incredible amounts of contention. And quite a few of the contractors didn't think what Doug was doing was worth it. I mentioned the demo, I think, for pretty much everybody in the room, because as was mentioned, there was a standing ovation. Notice that the absence of romance in this meeting did not lead to a standing ovation after the first panel. That's what we're missing here. We're missing why this thing is so totally great that everybody should have been on their feet yelling and screaming. The standing ovation there, I think, came from that instant recognition that something important had happened and that we didn't have to be the same thereafter. That happens in Texas tent meetings when you get converted. And as most Baptist preachers will tell you, it doesn't last long. But for the few that realized what Doug was trying to do, it made an enormous difference, because it actually reset the whole conception of what was reasonable to think about doing personal computing. And what we were seeing there was not a personal computer, but personal computing shown to the large world in the first time as a cohesive environment that you could actually live. It wasn't just a place you went to do a few important transactions, but it was a place. It was a place that you lived. You could stay in there for hours each day. You could do all of your important communication in there with with people regardless of where they were. You could understand what the group understood much more. So I think that was the significance. I have a priceless memory of Andy Van Dam that I just can't let I have to use a minute to explain. Everybody here, I think, probably knows Andy, but I met Andy for the first time at this demo. And Andy, in those days, had hair out to here and a beard. He was actually a wild man. And he will admit this because he's an honest guy when he has time to give his talk. And actually, his first impulse was not to be able to believe what he had just seen. And I just happened to be there when he and Doug had this extended conversation about what it was that had actually been shown. And this is a wonderful thing because Andy is really tough, but he's really honest. And after this extended conversation, Andy realized that he had just seen a lot of what his and Ted Nelson's dreams had been about, and in fact, it was all right. That in fact, we needed more of this stuff. So that was a priceless moment. Then the last thing I wanted to mention as far as recollections here is that I believe, as a person who had nothing to do with this demo, but have been intertwined with these people for many years in many ways, that we cannot give Bill English too much praise for his part in this. And it is really true that Bill is the person that made all of this stuff go, and I mean every part of it. He was instrumental in making these displays. Nobody ever mentioned is, gee, what kind of displays were these? I thought everybody used calligraphic displays back in the 60s, and what we're seeing is black text on a white background. Where did that come from? Well, there's this huge problem that the big magnetic yoke displays were very inaccurate, very difficult to get readable characters on them, and the ones that you could get readable characters on were electrostatic displays that were from oscilloscopes, but you couldn't see what was there. And so they got this idea of, well, what if we just took a high-resolution industrial television camera, an 875-line television camera, and had it look at the face of this too-small-to-see oscilloscope, and we'll convert what the calligraphic display is doing to 875-line video, and now we can pipe it around the lab. That's what you were seeing, and that's why they had to rent the video links, because they were actually sending the raw display data up here up to San Francisco by microwave, sending the mouse stuff down by the telephone line. So this is an incredible system, and it was the first time, I believe, that anybody realized that black on white on a display is much better than the other way around. And it has to do with how your eyes adapt. If you're looking at paper and also looking at a display, you want to see a bright display so your eyes are not changing adaptation. This was later adapted at Park. So there are just zillions of things that you can't praise Bill English too highly. I just want to say one thing, as long as I'm standing up here, is that my own efforts at Xerox PARC would not have prospered if Bill English hadn't just volunteered himself to help me get organized. And I have never forgotten that. Now, the last thing I'd like to put before you has to do with a movement that is attracting the notice of very large companies, which is called the open source software movement. And I'd like to make an analogy to how things move forward. I've always been struck by the incredible wisdom of the people who designed the U.S. Constitution, because there are so many things that they could have done. And in fact, we can point to countries in the world that think that when you do something like that, it's the job to make lots of laws that regulate how people do things. Everybody wants to live in a system, they think. And the people who did the Constitution were far wiser than that. They realized that they could not make laws that would last even for 2 generations because things were changing. They saw what was happening in America as a progression. And making laws when you have a progression going on is a very bad idea. But they wanted to do something, and so in their great wisdom, they decided what we'll write in the Constitution is how to detect the start of disastrous errors and head them off. We'll let everybody do what they want, but we'll make a system that will not tear itself apart because of all of this freedom and enterprise. And if you think about where we are right now, our ability to do software for any purpose, and especially for human purposes, is abysmally low. So the worst thing we could ever do is to try and pick any system, whether it's an operating system like MS-DOS, whether it's a programming system like Java. Treating these things like religions that are going to bring salvation is a terribly wrong thing to do. What we need is lots of different things going on at once. And if you think about it, why does science work? Science works because in the first order it doesn't have dogma. What scientists agree on is not the way the universe works, but how they're going to argue about it. And if you apply that to how to make progress, is what we want to have is lots of different experiments like NLS and get better at arguing about them, and eventually we'll get more and more good ones. The saving grace of the internet, then, is not all the things that commercial interests are going to do to it, but the fact that good things will also go out on the internet. And this is going to, I think this is going to happen in a stronger and stronger way over the next few years. One of the things that we've discovered it in our own group ourselves, if you put out something interesting on the internet, pretty soon you have a bunch of colleagues. And those colleagues, generally speaking, are not interested in becoming a member of your religion. They're interested in participating in a way that is incredibly fruitful. And we've discovered that the colleagues that we found on the internet that we've never met before are often totally top people. And so the result of these things is software that's better than most company organizations can possibly come out with. And we don't want a religion here, but we want more and more people to realize, hey, let the software be free, because the money in this business is always going to be in services of some kind. There just isn't margin any other way, so quit fooling around with it. Just think of the software as like an advertising expense. Pay the money, get it out there, and then see if you can build something larger around it. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. That was a perfect setup for the next session. And I just want to amplify on some remarks Alan made. I want to second just how important it is to see this full, unedited video of the original Engelbart demo. And what we're going to do is 2 things. One, the extraordinary backstage Stanford team, who you all do not see, but who I am in deep debt to, said, no problem, we will digitize it, we'll put it up on the website in its entirety immediately after this program. So we have one last panel before lunch, and I'll invite our panelists on. And as they're coming on, I just want to say a word or two. This is the panel that's going to start us now looking out 30 years. Their mission is to describe the horizon ahead, and we've assembled a wonderful team of people to do this. As they're miking up, starting from my far left, is John Markoff, technology writer, New York Times. Is that correct, John? You know, some people don't need titles, and Markoff's been around the Valley so long, he's just John Markoff, and oh yeah, that's right, he works for a newspaper somewhere, it's on the East Coast. John has been around this business forever, and he's older than he looks. He started out at InfoWorld in the very early days when InfoWorld was like the only magazine covering the business. Went from there to the San Francisco Examiner. Went from there, it really pioneered the New York Times West Coast coverage of technology and is universally acknowledged as the leading technology writer in the country today. He has managed to find time to write several books in the process, and occasionally is not just a bystander, occasionally gets wrapped up in his stories. Witness Kevin Mitnick and the situation a little while ago. So, and John is someone whom I personally count on regularly for advice and counsel about what lies ahead. Next to John is Eric Drexler. Eric is the founder and chairman of the Foresight Institute here in Palo Alto. The Foresight Institute is in the vanguard of research into nanotechnology. It's really peculiar to think of a field being invented by someone, but Eric Drexler basically invented nanotechnology in his own way in material sciences. I think we're going to look back in a couple of decades and see Eric in the same way we see Doug Engelbart today. But he also not only caused people to start thinking about nanotechnology, especially laudable as he started asking people to think about the consequences of nanotechnology and this amazing revolution that it might suddenly serve up on our doorsteps. He also is not just a nanotechnologist, he's also a crazed software developer, has been involved in the hypertext community for a long time, and you'll see his people around here with these blue hats. It says Crit Suite Open Source. It's their latest software product offering, and if you're curious about it, you should talk to him. Next to Eric is Paul Horn. Paul works for a small software startup on the East Coast that also has offices out here. Paul is the senior vice president and director of IBM Research. So he's basically adult supervision for 2,900 researchers spread in 8 labs around the world who are doing everything from making pen computing practical to laying copper on silicon to studying galactic rotations. He is a master at turning technology into products that actually make it into the marketplace and touch and change our lives. And next is Dave Evans. Dave is based in Australia. He's the managing director of Uniquest Limited, which is affiliated with the University of Queensland. And I know Australia, it's a long ways away, and even with the internet, we kind of go, yeah, what are the, Fosters? None of that. The amazing thing about Uniquest is it's one of the most successful examples on the planet today of very, very effective collaboration between university and the marketplace. Their business is taking university ideas, putting them out into the marketplace, turning them into products. He's got an even harder job than Paul Horn, because at least Paul, in theory, can fire people who don't follow his instructions. Dave has no such authority, and yet Uniquest has brought out a dizzying array of products to the market, from commercial vaccines and therapeutics to software and the like. He met Doug in 1965 by chance and got sucked into Augment till almost 1970, and his life's never been the same since. Last, but certainly not least, is Stuart Card. We keep trying to find ways to avoid talking about the mouse today, but I have no choice. Stuart is a Xerox Research Fellow here at the Palo Alto Research Center, where he also is the manager of the User Interface Lab. Up to all sorts of interesting things today, these days. Lots of new technology spinning out of there. He's even got a book, Readings and Information Visualization, in the works. But the important thing you should know about Stuart is he's the proximate cause why you use mice on your desk and not Doug's knee-mounted thing. Stuart is the person who at Park did the definitive studies that demonstrated that the mouse had higher values, higher fits values in terms of human interface than any of the other competing pointing devices. So it was basically, he was the guy who goes, yes, go with the mouse, and it was let loose into our culture, for better or worse. Maybe you can tell me why the wire was at the top once upon a time, is now at the bottom, before this is over. So gentlemen, our mission is to talk about the horizon ahead. What are the surprises out over the next 30 years? What will amaze us, throw us into consternation? What's ahead?
Well, I'm always ready to start. I think that a lot of our thinking is about the PC. And I really believe that the age of the PC is over. I think you're going to... The fact that we're talking about how you interact with computers is backward thinking in some sense, because computing is going to basically be invisible in our environment, and you're going to interact with your environment in very seamless ways. The mouses of the future could be your finger or your voice or your eyes that are being tracked, and you'll interact with your environment very much the way you interact with other human beings.
Ubiquity, please, Lord, let it not be running under Windows. Anyone can go, wants to jump in here.
Well, I'll have a go. I guess when I first met Doug, the thing that hit me was immediately talking about bootstrapping. And although it's been mentioned a couple of times, that's, to me, what the central bit was. And it was partly because I wasn't a computer scientist. I'm not a computer scientist, and I'll never be a computer scientist. That I think I understood this from the start. So looking ahead, what has to be done is the human side of the system. If you read the Bootstrap Alliance materials, you'll see this lovely little graph that has up this side, it's got human systems. Across here, it's got tool systems. And clustered down right in the corner is the sort of envelope of our current capability. And out here is the frontier where Doug and the team wanted to get to. And then sort of placed in that space are fortresses or outposts. And I think the real challenge is now we've got enough tools, we've got the infrastructure to be able to design those experiments where we can really see if having those sort of three levels of bootstrapping, the system, the improvement system, and the system to improve the improvements, can really give us this scaling effect, this multiplier on our capability to solve problems creatively, to be able to have a greater collective IQ than the individual IQ. That, to me, is where the challenge is.
In my career as a reporter, I've had sort of two, what I think of as Lincoln Steffens moments. Lincoln Steffens was a journalist who went to Russia, and he said, "I've seen the future and it works." Well, sort of. But one was visiting Xerox PARC, visiting Ted Kaler under very odd circumstances, which I won't go into, and seeing an Alto in 1979. And that sort of reset my mind for the ensuing decade. But the other one, which I think sort of is more germane on what goes forward, was going to a now defunct supercomputer company, massively parallel supercomputer company, Kendall Square Research, in 1989, a decade later, and seeing, they were building a machine out of their own custom CMOS processors, and seeing these processors and being told that these processors were being fabbed on the same line that was making the processor for the Sharp Wizard. And I got this, I mean, it's just one of these moments where you understand that the world has changed. And for me, what came out of seeing that was a realization of what I think of as inversion in computing and sort of the economics of computing that I think are going to drive it going forward. And that thought is that once upon a time, you know, Paul talked about smart people who started out of the Pentagon and ended up in Hollywood. Once upon a time, innovation in the computing industry trickled down from the top. But sometime, I think largely due to the end of the Cold War and sort of the consequences of Moore's Law, all of that turned around. And now, I think increasingly, you can make the statement that the most powerful computers are increasingly found under Christmas trees. And I don't think we've realized, I mean, as much as everybody talks about Moore's Law, I don't think people realize how much of, to look at this system, people still tend to look at things as if they are static. I mean, if you're in Silicon Valley, now everything is web commerce. And, I beg to differ. I think that that's an interim stage, and we are in a very unstable situation. And increasingly, technology is coming from the bottom up. I mean, I loved seeing, not long ago, I think about a year ago, IBM's densest magnetic storage technology went first into laptop computers, which I think is, everywhere I look, I mean, just sort of, you have a hammer, everything's a nail. Everywhere I look, there are sort of examples of technology now trickling up, and I think that economics is what shapes things going forward.
As you said that, John, the thought of people going from Pentagon to Hollywood is scary enough. God help us if they start going the other way. Eric, you want to jump in?
I think that we're likely in the next 30 years to face many surprises, which I don't care to outline because I think they'll be surprising. I think we should expect to be very surprised, terrifyingly surprised. My hope, and something that I do expect, is that in the next 10 years we'll see a further partial completion of Engelbart's unfinished revolution, one that will make us better able to deal with surprises, more wise as a society, not solve all problems, not make everyone be reasonable and similar utopian goals, but consider. What drives progress is the evolution of knowledge, which has to do with knowledge being generated and copied and sifted and winnowed and propagating around. Speech was big progress. We learned to speak, and that made us human. Writing gave us civilization. Printing gave us modern civilization. Television almost took it away. It basically gave you an amplification of one side of a conversation. The web differs from those. It's given us something that's more like printing, but better. So it's an extension of the printing revolution. But in the 1980s, Doug Engelbart, Ted Nelson, many other people were, largely learning from them, were looking at it and saying, we're going to build a hypertext system. Yes, it's going to have graphics, and it's going to have links, and it's going to have things called backlinks. And now we have a hypertext system, and it has graphics, and it has links, and it's distributed publishing, and it's great. But we only have half of it. We have the half that lets everyone speak. We don't have the half that lets people respond and be heard by the other listeners. And that's what's needed to make knowledge be something that's socially refined, and I think what's needed to make society work better and smarter. And that's why we're doing this open source software development effort called Crit Suite. It's free and can be contributed to, which said where there are laptops, demos are possible, so watch out.
We'll distribute business plans at the back of the room. Stuart.
Well, I'd like to think off of some of the first thing that Eric started with is sort of civilization evolves with the ability to grab hold of and comprehend large amounts of knowledge. My candidate for one of the things of the revolution 30 years from now would be what you might call the knowledge bubble. It should be possible for you to carry in something, say about as unobtrusive as a wristwatch, a vast amount of sort of all of your information environments. Of course, wirelessly networked so that you can add to it and so on. And it may be that you use whatever display surface happens to be locally around. It may be that you carry some sort of thing with you. But look at how this changes sort of, I think of it in terms of the amount of knowledge you can get to kind of in unit time, the cost of knowledge characteristic function we sometimes look at. How much knowledge can you get to in how many seconds or so on. So imagine, and it's sort of unappreciated how much just the amount of time it gets to go from knowledge piece to knowledge piece has an effect on you. So imagine you have all of this stuff that you're interested in, plus references and pieces of libraries that you've downloaded. My daughter carries a 30-pound backpack to school because the school won't provide lockers. And I looked in it, and there's 1,300 pages worth of papers and text in there, and that left out the 1,500 pages that she couldn't carry because they were too heavy. Well, imagine you have all of that, and now instead of going to a library being a place you go to study, the library is the place where you go to chat while your high-speed link sort of predictively loads the chunk of the library that you would like to have with you. Instead of going to the library, you just have the library or the part that's relevant to it. And then once you have that, then that gets into, and in fact, with one of the implications, underappreciated so far in the conference of Engelbart's vision of all these people connected together is that when you have all this information, the thing that's in short quantity now is attention. And so now a lot of your technologies would go to what's the way in which you manage attention using both the machine and other things.
Paul, you started us off on a path here that seems to be emerging as a key theme, this pervasiveness, ubiquity. John, the notion of inversion suggests that these devices will come faster than we expect, unless you're in a military uniform, in which case it'll take a long time. Give us, I'll start with you, Paul, but the rest of the panel join in. Specific devices and specific dates. How soon are these things practical and real?
Well, let me try to frame this with a couple
Don't slip
points.
out of my question.
Okay, no. No, I'll try to be explicit. If you looked at the first magnetic disk drive in 1954, it was about that big and it cost $10,000 to store a megabyte. Now, in your personal computers, it costs about 10 cents to store a megabyte. In 20 years from now, it'll cost about $1 to store a terabyte. And those trends, technology trends, we understand now, and they're probably going to exist more or less the way we extrapolate out by the Moore's law type.
Of course, my 3D graphics file will still occupy 4 terabytes.
Got $4.
And that's only $4.
So take it.
The concept that Stuart was predicting that you will have devices on your body that are, in 20, 30 years, can massively store information and display them, project it, perhaps holographically, is very real. Now, a lot of the things are evolutionary. So if you talk about talking to a computer and having it understand you, the elements of natural language understanding exist now in the laboratory. But before you'll have a real conversation, that's going to start to gradually happen over the next 5 to 10 to 20 years. Gradually, the computers are going to be more and more like companions, and they'll understand you better and better. But initially now, it's very crude. And so I can't give you a date when that happens, but you're going to start to see those trends almost immediately.
Part of when Doug's vision went off the rails with computer science was when everybody got distracted by the idea of personal computing and said, okay, well, we're going to do these standalone things. And of course, now we're in a world where everything is connected theoretically in a client-server environment, and there's arguments over, do we go to a world of information utilities where everything is up in a big cyber cloud in the sky and you have access devices, or we stick with the client-server model, or we do something else? Where do we end up in this trade-off between local and remote over the next 10, 20 years?
Well, I would not even begin to answer that, Paul. But
now, you're a journalist, John, so if you want to duck it, you just have to ask the question to someone else on the panel.
Let me do that, because in sort of dealing with, oh God, I'm on this panel, what am I going to say question, I asked Bill Duvall, who was a member of the Augment group, sort of how we should frame these questions, and he suggested that the most important thing to think about is the consequences of this now ubiquitous technology going forward. And I'm still not sure, for all the gadgetry and the boy toys and that kind of stuff, whether this is going to end up being dystopian or utopian. I think it's still a very open question. And I wanted to sort of cite one sort of focal point where I see all of these sort of, if you will, the social construction of technology issues coming together. And that is in the fact that the FCC has mandated that you be able to know where every cellular telephone is in the next 2 years. And my point here is that there are a couple of ways you can do it, which I think I'm just sort of using this as a sort of a model for the way we think about all technologies. And there's, for example, a little company in Silicon Valley called Surf that has got a one-chip GPS receiver, which basically allows the user to publish their location to the network. Now, that's one model of doing it. So the user has control and decides when he or she lets the world know where they are. Assuming that it's a good thing. I mean, everybody knows that this is coming. How as a society should we deploy this technology? The other model, of course, and there's a company in Pennsylvania that has a model which allows the cellular towers to triangulate. And of course, the network knows where you are anytime you have your cellular phone on. Well, these two technologies are going to fight it out in the marketplace. And I think it's sort of a classic example. At any point where you see these technologies coming into the world, they all have social consequences. And that's what we should...
It's very depressing, given that the battle of standards over the last 3 decades is that all other things being equal, the inferior standard wins. Jump in.
I sort of think I'm in a time warp here. This conversation is sort of like conversations we were holding in 1969. And they were still focused on not the gadgets, but the systems and the tools. And this sort of switching the focus to trying to understand whether we can really accelerate this process, we can really bootstrap, use the tools to very deliberately to help us develop and co-evolve the human and tool systems and do it in a very deliberate way is still not something people find easy to talk about. It's even in the presentation in '68 and the one that followed it in '69, the only way we could get it across was to talk about the way NLS worked and the mouse and all that, and sort of put alongside some of the community issues. And perhaps the most powerful way, it was mentioned by Alan Kay, that Jeff Rawson and Bill Paxton talking about the way they were using LLS as a tool to build NLS. And it's that on a wider and a bigger scale that I think is the missing bit in what has to go ahead.
David, I think you're psychic because you just answered my last question.
Oh.
And the question was this. For each of you, what is looking ahead over the next couple of decades? What is either your highest hope or your deepest fear? Now, David's answered it. I can't figure it out if he told me his hope or his fear, but he answered it. For the rest of you, what are your hopes and fears over the next decades?
Well, my fear is that what the personal computer did was it moved you from centralized computing to distributed computing on a personal scale. It moved power to the individual. Now, with pervasive networking, that allows the re-centralization of computing, and you can move power back. So you can get companies that read all your email and read all your net accesses and actually contain a great deal of personal information about whatever you do. And it's my fear is that unless we deal with that, which is a social problem, that the technology will evolve to lock that in.
There is a great concern about the privacy aspects and the social aspects about a world where computing is pervasive or ubiquitous and information can be passed around readily with no real control by the individual. That's, I think, for many people, the biggest fear of the world we're coming into. We have a little technology in one of my laboratories where you pass information around by touching. You carry the personal information on your body and you communicate to other people when you touch them. Now, imagine people are becoming really part of the internet. They're now digital, they're commuting digital information and about them, about themselves, and that's very, very scary.
Eric?
What scares me most are bad ideas that seem like good ideas. In particular, fatal ideas that seem like good ideas. Here's an example. Let's try to prevent widespread surveillance in the world. How do we prevent surveillance? Well, each of you would have to be searched to make sure you're not carrying a camera. Isn't that nice? So don't support people who say they're trying to suppress surveillance wholesale, because that means a very intrusive form of surveillance indeed. Well, that's an example, and I don't think that that particular point of view has been properly brought to bear on a certain school of thought on this crucial social issue of what do we do about openness and privacy. It's a bad idea. It's surviving. We need to create an environment in which bad ideas appear on the web, in which the comments and criticisms on them are visible to the readers of them, and the bad ideas sink fast so the good ideas can float to the top. If we do that, we may survive.
John, you have the last word.
You know, I think that the Big Brother question has really been reframed since 1984. I think I spend more of my time these days worrying about little brother than I do about Big Brother. And with the exception of Enemy of the State, which is a movie I highly recommend if you at all tend toward paranoia, it's the movie for you. Where Big Brother got a little bit of respect after he's been out of fashion for a while. But the nature of the artifact of the web that most troubles me is the fact that transaction data is ubiquitous, and it is sort of the raison d'etre for data mining. And I'm not sure what the consequences of it is, because in the little consequence is that they might know that you're going to have more cholesterol. I'm not sure how bad of a societal thing that is, but when you aggregate that data, you begin to be able to build real-time complete models of behavior. And I don't know where that's going. I mean, it can be done, and like many of these technologies, I think perhaps therefore it will be done. And will we end up in a world like True Names, where what you must hide at all cost is your name? I mean, when you're in this electronic world, I think that's a bad thing.
And I will take a stab. I don't want to, but let me amplify on what you've heard. The things I fear most are standards. The person who really taught me this was Jaron Lanier, who hopefully he won't talk about it this afternoon because he now has an extra 3 minutes. Something he calls karma vertigo. Let me come back to karma vertigo and let me explain it in my words. The scary thing about standards is that they always stay around a lot longer than we think. We really hope they'll disappear. You know, we hope our standards get accepted, but we never think about what happens after they're accepted and they get repurposed for other things. And if you just think about a piece of email you send or something you do on the web, that there's a stratigraphic column of a rubble of collapsed old standards. I mean, it's sort of like cutting into the side of a tail in the Middle East. You know, there's SMTP and some other stuff in there, and then there's ASCII, which was this, you know, Funk City code created for a machine that never really existed and was never intended for personal computers, all the way down to the alphabet, which is this weird agglomeration of things that probably reaches all the way back to some idle farmer in Babylonia cooling his heels in the water of his canal while he's pressing images on a piece of clay. And the scary thing is that the standards come around for one purpose, they end up put to another. Here in the Bay Area, we have an automated toll-taking system for cars. There were 3 different ways we could have done it. One way is an anonymous card that you recharge with value so they don't know your identity. Instead, they've taken the phone number approach where they have a record of every time your car crosses a point on the bridge. You know, this is the stuff that Ken Starr is going to subpoena someday, because obviously he's never going to stop doing what he's doing. But the consequence is what Jaron calls karma vertigo, that standards are like karma, that the echoes of the details of those standards stay around for a very long time, and the moment anyone contemplates the consequences, they'll get a bad case of vertigo. On that note, thank you very much.